I was so delighted to be part of the previous workshop with you, Maya. And as you took us so deeply into the world of folktales and understanding the metaphor, the imagery, how we can learn about character through the dialogue, I was thinking what in some ways how we're giving so much of the same message, but through different lenses, and that I'm going to be talking about personal story, but so much of those same ideas. So I look forward to tying in some of your ideas through a very different perspective of our personal stories and how we understand ourselves in that way, and can actually grow through understanding our stories and change our relationship to our stories as we move forward. So actually, I'm going to share screen. I saw, Eric, you gave me the ability to do that. So let me that's not working. Hang on. Let me just, it was. I apologize. I think I closed out the very thing that's not it. I think I closed out what I was trying to share with you. So let me come back and find it again. Stop the share while I do my search so you don't have to be with me here. So prepared, and then all right, I'm ready to bring you in with me now. And let me set this up, and this might be, there we are. Can everyone see the screen? Just a nod.
Yes, we see a lake.
All right. You see a lake and hopefully two travelers, two monks on a journey, a senior monk and a junior monk who are taking a trip. And as they get to this wide river and think about crossing, they pause for a moment because the water is running quickly, but they know that they can make it, they can do it. And then they notice off to the side a very young and beautiful woman who is also looking anxiously at this fast moving water. And she looks at them as they look at her and she says, "Can you please help me across?" And the young monk looks to the older monk because he knows they have taken a vow to never touch a woman. And so he is clear on what the answer must be. But the older monk, without hesitation, reaches over, lifts up the woman onto his shoulders and carries her across. The younger monk is speechless. He can't believe what this elder monk has done. And they wander on their journey speechless, no words crossing between them for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, until then the younger monk can't stand it any longer. He says, "I can't believe you put that woman on your shoulders. We made a vow. We made a vow that we would not touch a woman, and you did." And the elder monk paused and turned to me and said, "Yes, but I put her down by the riverside, and you're still carrying her with you." And stories are just like that, our personal stories. What are the ones that we carry with us that cause us distress or cause us to think less of ourselves as the hero of the story than perhaps we are, that keep us stuck in what I call a thin story of who we are and what's possible, that limit us as we step into our future stories? So I call these thin stories or constraining stories that come out of the narrative therapy literature, but I brought them into the healing story world that we can understand how powerful our own stories are and how they either have the ability to support us in stepping into continually bigger stories of potential for ourselves, or how the stories we carry actually can limit us, can constrain us, can keep us from being actually who we are. So as Joseph Campbell, who talked about the hero's journey, said, "All the gods, all the heavens, and all the hells are within you. And they are in fact contained within our stories." Another story coming out of the Buddhist tradition, but I think it contains for us a metaphor that might be helpful. Some of you might be familiar with the story of the Golden Buddha. It goes back to a beautiful golden Buddha that was built back around the year 1000 by Thai monks in the Bangkok, what was now the Bangkok area. It was said to have been about 10 feet tall and over 5 tons of pure gold that created this Buddha. But shortly thereafter, when word came that the Burmese army was invading and they knew that it would attack, and in fact, what they were known for were pillaging the very treasures of this culture, the Thai monks made that they couldn't hide it. It was far too big, and they came up with the idea of hiding it in plain sight. And so they began to cover this beautiful golden Buddha in mud, and they packed it until it looked and resembled just a stone Buddha, not unlike many of the other Buddhas throughout Thailand. And there it sat in plain sight, as indeed the Burmese army came, invaded, walked right by this symbol of the Buddhist faith and paid no attention to it. But unfortunately, they killed most of the monks. So years passed, and people continued to walk by, giving no thought or sight to this golden Buddha, until it is said, and I don't know if this is an urban legend or not, but in 1957, they were building a new temple and decided that they would bring this large statue, bring it in and put it in the temple. And as they attempted to lift it, it began to actually crack, much to the horror of the construction workers who are trying to maintain this stone Buddha, who was ancient and had perhaps some value. But then in the cracks, in the crumbling of the stone, they saw a glint of yellow and called others there. And actually, rather than trying to maintain it from cracking further, they opened the cracks to see the gold that was revealed there. And then in great excitement, they began to remove more and more of the mud to reveal this center of incredibly precious gold. What is not unlike us and stories, that we have this beautiful, pure center that is, I believe, sacred, and that over a lifetime, it gets covered in protective layers, which are maintained by stories. And these stories are there indeed to protect us. But in fact, they also can limit us from seeing the potential of what is there inside. These stories become the lens through which we see the whole rest of the world. So it impacts not only how we hold ourselves now, but how we step into every future story that comes, because this protective layer of stories that is trying to keep us safe actually limits us at times, because of this perspective, from moving into more, so that we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are in this protective way. So I want to share one more story and give you an example from my own life. And some of you who have worked with me before may have heard this story, so bear with me. But this is me at 8 years old. I was a kid who was full of passion for life and expressed that often in exuberant ways. The story that I want to share occurred on Christmas Eve, and in the place where I grew up, we had some rituals and traditions that were very precious to me. And one is that we would go to church on Christmas Eve, and there was a series of both lessons and carols. And the Christmas carols I had known since I was very, very small. And they brought me such joy, because they, to me, represented the anticipatory excitement of what was to unfold the following day with Christmas, when I would be showered with presents and gifts. So singing these songs opened me to all of that joy and passion and excitement. On this particular Christmas Eve, I was seated between my mother and my father, and my 3 older siblings were far down the pew trying to get some distance, because they were much older than me. And with each carol that we sang, I began to get more and more excited until one of my favorite carols came, and I stood there and I could just fill myself with passion that I was belting out this song at the top of my lungs. And at that moment, my father leaned down and put his hand over my mouth. And immediately I was filled with shame. Once again, I'd gotten too loud, too big, too much, and I sat down and could feel the tears just coming down my cheeks. This moment became for me a defining thin story, that when I started to feel myself getting passionate, getting big, that I would be alerted by this story of pull it back, sit down, you're being an embarrassment, you are too much. This became mud on my golden Buddha. This became mud that kept me safe from further embarrassment, but also kept me from expressing the light that was within. And what happens is a thin story begins to generalize itself to other stories, so that other moments when I might have either expressed that joy or expressed my thinking, my thoughts in a way that had passion, I pulled myself back and did less. And in fact, what our amygdala does, which is the part of our brain that's the oldest part, is it screens for stories that are happening that we need to be aware and protect ourselves from, so that we're looking for that story that could put us in that same uncomfortable position, and we pull back from it. So we start looking for them. We start looking for the same reinforcers of, oh, see, I shouldn't have said that. Ooh, I shouldn't have sung so loudly or even sung at all. So rather than looking for the stories or holding on to the stories that actually allow us to grow and expand, we're looking for the stories that keep us safe. And that just puts more and more mud on our Buddha, covering it. What that leads to is what I call constraining messages. And I'm going to put out for you here a list of what I think are actually constraining messages to listen for in our stories. So they are really, I think, around 4 themes. One is when we make meaning of a story that we don't belong, that we're alone, that there's no help there for us. Or when we make meaning of a story that we can't do it, we're inadequate, we don't have the capabilities. Or when we make meaning of a story that I don't matter, my voice shouldn't be heard, that it's coming from that place of hurt. Or when we make meaning of a story that we shouldn't bother. I'm not going to do it. So it comes out to, I don't belong, I can't, it doesn't matter, I won't. That these are all meanings that we make out of a story that keeps us limited and contained in that small story. So what do we do with that? And this is where the realm of how do we move from a thin story to a thicker story, a sustaining story that can hold us. So there are a few steps that we can take, and we're going to play with some of these steps as I get you a little bit more information that I'm just downloading up front. And then we're going to go into breakout rooms and play with what might be a thin story in your lives and how we might begin to walk around it differently to build it into a little bit of a thicker story. So how to thicken a story. The first is to pause and reflect. What's the meaning I'm making of this? And is that meaning sustaining to me or keeping me smaller than I am? Challenge that meaning. Is it true? Is there more to this than I'm seeing? And what I found is oftentimes when I ask, is the meaning you're making of this story true? People say, yes, absolutely. I should not sing out loud. Then I ask a secondary question of, well, what else might be true? And that can lead us into other stories that perhaps hold other meanings. That's how we begin to expand our perspective through what I call alternative outcome stories. And this is a basic central tenet in narrative therapy is we have one story that becomes a defining story. How do we find other stories that start the same, but end differently, and value those endings enough that we can tie those stories to this thin one, because we're not going to change this story, but what we might begin to do is to thicken this story. So what we're trying to do is break the habitual patterns of meaning making and bring more multiple meanings or multiple insights to this story so that it can hold more of us in it. And when we have a thicker story, what we actually have is more choices of where to go next. And therefore, with more choices, we have more agency, more capability, and we can begin to change those constraining messages into more sustaining messages. So out of that expanding perspective, we can begin to reframe that story, and within it perhaps find compassion for ourselves, or acceptance, or even gratitude. And all of these abilities within a story are the beginnings of how we can actually expand and thicken a story. And lastly, to begin to then reinforce our thicker stories. So challenging ourselves to step into an old story in new ways. And by doing that, by tying those repetitive thin storylines to these thicker outcomes. So what that leads to, actually, what I've done here just for a moment is I've gone back to my story and done this same process with myself. So my pause in reflecting is realizing that this has become a repetitive storyline that's not helpful or sustaining to me. By the time I got to college, I wasn't raising my hand anymore. By the time I was considering careers, I was thinking small for myself. So this was a storyline that I needed to shift. So I challenged the meaning. The meaning I was making is I'm an embarrassment when I get too excited, too loud, too strong, and that I actually should stay smaller, quieter, and more in the background. So is that true? What else might be true? So what are the stories that have led me to see me differently? And sometimes we can't find from the inside, we need to find them from the outside. And then we can reframe. The reframe is my strength, voice, ideas, passion. They actually fill me. And when I'm strong, I can be of help to others, which is what led me to my career now as a psychologist, but also as a storyteller and a story listener and a story change agent. And I do that through coaching. And then reinforcing the ways that I actually have used my voice, used my strength to help others. So coming back to this, what we do see depends mainly on what we look for. What we pay attention to is what grows. So how do we shift our attention from always looking for what's thin to begin to pause, stop, and actually look for something different? So that shifts the thicker stories in what I call resilience and sustaining messages. So where do we find and look for the stories that show places where we are connected, where we belong, stories where we have actually been competent and capable, stories where we feel valuable, stories where we feel hopeful, where we have stepped in, where we have taken a step to do something that is courageous. So we're trying to build what I call the 4 C's, and to look for stories in our lives that we start looking for those to stand on, to hold us. So as we go to the traditional story model, there's that sort of beginning, the middle, the end. And in the middle, we always focus on the challenges and turning points. But I want to break that middle part down just a little bit for you to look at what enables turning points in a story. And this is where we're going to come a little to some of the things that Maya was talking about in her workshop, that when she's talking about the magic helper there, we're never alone. There are always, and I put the green as the positives, there are always helpers. There are always resources if we look for them. That's true in folktales. And the reason it's true in folktales is because it's true in our life as well. And I think when we hold up the personal stories and the folktales, we'll see the power of the folktales is that they, in fact, have so many messages that can help us through our personal stories as well. So where have been the helpers? Where are they? Where are the resources? And to listen for those. That's what's going on externally. But internally, what does this story actually say about your internal strengths and abilities to get where you got to. That even though you're making meaning of I can't or I won't, there is some part of you that is still going, still showing up in some way. How do we bring those abilities, strengths, skills to the surface and say, where else have those shown up? Where are stories in your life where actually you have utilized those and the ending has gone differently? There will always be those external tricksters, resistors, challengers, constrainers that keep our stories thin. There's also internal tricksters. Those are the voices in us that are saying, I can't, I won't, I don't. And that we need to be listening for those. And as we hear them, begin to try and pull out those alternative, again, other side, because it's all in there. And it's what we listen to and what we pay attention to is what grows. So as we're looking at this, this could be a multi-day workshop where we actually pull the stories out of all these areas, but I want to focus on the external allies that become internal voices and how we internalize those as stories within us. So if we think about who are the allies in my story and how do I bring those in me to carry those stories with me? So to think about, all right, the cheerleaders in my story, in my life story, who are those who know me and have seen me at my best? And when I fall into a thin story, if I remember their stories about me, it will help again for me to expand my sense of self. Who are the challengers? And these are sometimes the tricksters, but they're the ones who have tested us and they give us insight to actually how we have persevered and carried on and move forward in either in spite of or because of their challenging us. They're also in our stories and are important. Those tricksters, they teach us lessons. And what are those lessons we've learned and how we integrated them, incorporated them so that we carry the wisdom of having met the trickster and survived. The mentors are those we learn from as role models. They're the wise one who shows up and shares with us their stories or their secrets that empower us because they're in us now. And then, of course, they're the heroes and heroines who are in our folktales or in our literature that we carry their stories in us as well. And those lessons are in us to step on, to hold on to. And then the guides, those who anyone whose stories have shed light on our own. And those can be fictional characters or real life people. It doesn't matter. Their stories, once they're in us, become part of what I call our internal board of advisors. So all those folktales we have learned and heard or told, they have struck some chord in us that becomes internal wisdom that we need to claim because they can help us thicken our stories and to stand on that. So here they are again, the people you've known or known you. Those are the cheerleaders, the mentors, the challengers. There's famous people or historical figures, those we look up to. And then there's fictional characters, those guides who come to us. So in our breakout rooms, I'm going to ask you first to take some time, and I'm going to ask Eric to set up breakout rooms, Eric, for 3 people for 15 minutes. But before we go in, I invite you just to take some time to think about who's on your board, who've been the cheerleaders, as well as the challengers and the mentors, who've been your heroes and your guides. And you've seen I put in the middle of this is values. Because what we learn from each of these people and their stories, whether they are real people in our lives or fictional characters or heroes, that they have meaning for us that leaves us underneath with a certain value set. So as you put down and populate this with the important board of advisors in your life, what are the values that you have gained from knowing either these people or these stories that now you have within you that are important, that then what happens is that these values, these stories become the new lens through which we're interpreting our world and allow us new guides, new pathways to make meaning of what's happening and new options and agency to step into our next story more strongly, more clearly, more powerfully. So take just a few minutes, and what I'm going to invite you to do when you're in your breakout rooms is then to choose one character from here. And just move ahead to show you what's in the breakout room. So we'll go back and forth for a minute. But who is someone on your board of advisors? And how did they get there? And why are they there? And how you know the why is to tell a story about when they had an impact on you. And what did you learn about yourself, about what's important through that experience? So I want to share a couple of stories, again, to give you an idea of what this might look like. One came from a supervisor.
Excuse me, Lani.
Mhm.
If
Yep.
you can go off screen share, I can start putting people in the groups.
Perfect.
Go ahead.
Great.
Go ahead.
So you can continue brainstorming while I'm just sharing a couple of quick stories. Sorry, Eric, that I was keeping you from that.
That's fine.
When I first learned about this idea of internal board of advisors, it was through a story told by my supervisor. He talked about having working with children in foster care. And one little boy who was about 8 years old, who he'd become very fond of, had been sent from family to family and had finally found a family where he felt comfortable and had high hopes that he might be able to stay with them. But the clinician had just learned that the family couldn't keep him any longer and he was going to be moved again. And it was up to the therapist to let that little boy know in a session, because they were worried about how the child was going to hold it and respond. So before the therapist gave him the information, he told him about this idea of you've got people inside of you that you carry with you that keep you strong. And he shared this idea of guides and mentors and role models. And he said, so who might be on your board? And without hesitation, the 8-year-old said, but the shortstop on the Chicago Cubs. And the therapist thought, all right, that's fun. You like baseball. But he was wise enough to ask the little boy, why? And the boy responded, he's been traded 3 times, and yet he still puts on his uniform and goes out to play. What this child got so quickly is that this story of another who persevered through so much rejection knew that he couldn't stop. He had to keep going out to play. That's what it's about. In terms of challengers, my dad is a challenger on my board. For a long time, I had him as the chair of my board until I realized that wasn't helpful. That was keeping me in a thin story. He is an important enough voice in my life that he will always be on my board, but I don't give the power of some of my story interactions with him the same intensity that I did when I was a teen and a young adult. And what I've actually, through my story exploration and going back to that story of what happened when I was 8, have put him in his story perspective and how that story collided with mine in a way that I was making meaning that was less than who I was. And by questioning, as we talk, pause, reflecting, challenging the meaning I made at 8, at 30, is that meaning still true? At 50, is that meaning still true? And with each passing year, tying more alternative outcome stories to that challenger on my board to put that story in perspective and realizing the ways that he tested me, that I have grown beyond that and arrived at different values, not only of how I hold myself, but how I parent, that has very much contributed to my foundation. So the question is, in your breakout rooms, and you'll be with 3 people, so you'll each have about 5 minutes, is to talk about someone on your board, why they're there, how they got to be there, and a moment where you realized they impacted your story and what you've learned from that, and perhaps how that contributes to a value that you now hold dear. Eric, do you need more time or are you ready?
No, we're ready. And actually, most of the rooms have 2 people in them.
So does 15 minutes still feel appropriate? Or my thought is, if you can get them up to 3, can you rearrange a little bit, Eric, to get them up to 3, so that, and if it's all right, if there's some that have 4, that I want people to hear a variety of stories, and that can be really helpful to at least hear 2 other people.
Okay, just a minute.
Yep.
Just a moment. Okay, now almost all the rooms have 3 people.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate that. Are there any last questions before you head off to know what you're talking about and listening to? So please be respectful of time. Hopefully Eric will help me broadcast in 5-minute increments so that you can shift, but make sure you each have time to share a story. Thanks, Eric.
Okay, here we go. Oh, Maya, I didn't put you in a room, and Marin, I didn't put you in a room for some reason.
Maybe I am still a co-host.
No, that shouldn't affect. Oh, hello, David. Shall I put the 3 of you in a room right now?
Yeah,
It
Eric,
looks like-
I'm not in one either.
Eric, it looks
Yeah.
if there's 16 people who are unassigned.
Yeah, those people have their cameras turned off. We're not putting them in rooms
Oh, okay.
because they're probably in the kitchen and not even at their computer. Here
But
we
I see
go.
Maya
have to
there,
say,
and
I have my camera off until the breakout rooms.
Okay, just
Yeah,
a moment
yeah.
now.
And I did when the PowerPoint was on, just to, it's easier.
You know, I'm at the point now where I don't know how to assign people to additional rooms.
oh, I can do it. I can do it.
Oh, please do.
All right, let me help you. I'm gonna just go down by 3s and keep putting you in rooms. All right.
Yeah, Maya, Jennifer, and David. And
Yep.
Madeline.
Yep.
Let's
Good.
do that.
And this is Sudha.
There we go. I'm just gonna keep going down.
Get to go in
Um,
rooms.
Yeah.
Sometime you'll have to explain to me how you do it.
Ah.
Once I put people in the rooms the first time, I don't see how I can add people.
So let me see. So Marin, have you gotten? Let me just see what rooms I've got now. All right. Mine should be all set.
And
So I'm gonna put I see Sudha. I'm gonna put you in room 10, and Marin, I'll put you in room 10, and
Okay, I'm going to pause the recording.
thank you. Let me just put this in the slideshow. Is it? Okay, let me just, sometimes there you go, doesn't advance the way I want. So this is what I was just speaking to, essentially is reinforcing. Once you get a thicker story, it can be hard to hold on to it. So these are the ways that to reinforce it. First of all, what is the learning? What do I know or understand that I didn't have before? What do I see that I didn't see before? And what are the values in that for me, the lessons that I now have because of having lived this story? And then accepting those and bringing them forward through both acceptance, but also the gratefulness. In hard stories, and I've worked with, I've done this work in prisons. I've done this work with people who are homeless. I've done this work with youth at risk. I've done this work with cancer survivors and those who have lost loved ones to cancer. And they think, gratefulness, are you kidding? There's no aspect of this story I'm grateful for. But if we pause and look below it and see, are there people in your life now who were not there before because of this? Are you connected now in new ways that you weren't? Do you learn things that actually build your competence, which is your agency, your ability to move forward in the world differently? Are you clear now about who or what is important or how you are important to another? These are all those C's of resilience that actually lead you to stand in your next story stronger, even though you have been through this painful story or this traumatic story. Has it resulted, this is another C, in compassion? Have I shifted in any way my compassion for myself or another because of the way I've lived this story? Am I now able, and I talk about that difference between reacting, which is just letting that thin story continue to ride and ride, versus responding, which is when we put a pause in place and choose our response to that next step of how we want the story to go forward from here. And I call that claiming our responsibility. And that's living with awareness, with openness to learn, to challenge ourselves and our meaning and the frame. That's living our stories with the ability to respond and move our story differently forward. Lastly, as I was just saying, if you end with just the learning, you're not going to be able to integrate that and move forward. The next step is actually telling our stories that matter and can matter to others, that can be helpful to another, that knowing that our story matters is part of also building our resilience, but leading our learning to either step into our next story in a way that is more helpful to us or another, or helps another in that way. So in that way, to know that not only do we have this large internal advisors, or someone's called them this council of elders, but we are also on so many other people's boards. So that's this bottom line. And I invite you to hold this and to think about, for whom am I a cheerleader or a mentor or a challenger or a tormentor? That in fact, I want to be a challenger who is a mentor, not a tormentor. What are the values that I am actually living that others are receiving as our stories interact? Also, what are the stories as a storyteller that I tell? And how are those actually reinforcing the values that are important to me, that have the messages that I want another to hear, that will then impact what they carry inside of them, that will become a guide for them as they step forward in their lives. So the themes that I'm always thinking and holding as I'm sharing a story about myself or a folktale are, and bring it back to, oh, sorry, it's not advancing and I don't know why, but let me, nor can I get out. So I'm gonna just stop the share and I'm gonna see if I can advance it myself to, here we go. Back to the share again. The sustaining messages of I am connected, that to let people know the importance of being connected, of belonging, that capable agency. So the first is love, and the importance of love in living this life, the importance of agency, that we are capable and competent, and what are the underneath tools, skills, abilities that allow us to move forward, that movement actually matters, that we impact not only our own lives, but we're continually impacting other people's lives. These are the themes of the stories at their most human basic level. And lastly is the courage it takes to be living this life, to actually continue to live our stories forward, and to name that courage and to see it in ourselves, in our characters, and each other as they become, we become and they become the guides for those around us. And that is what enables us, let me just see if I can move it to this next one, to keep put down what we need to put down and keep walking together, connected and sharing this life. So I'm going to take it off, and in the few minutes we have left, open it up to comments or reflections or questions. Sarah.
I'm wondering what you think of applying this paradigm to historical storytelling, to living history, because this is something that I'm wanting to do, is tell the untold stories, undertold stories here in the United States. You know, African Americans, Native Americans, women, you know, everybody. And in this era of polarization, being able to tell those stories in a way that would be healing and transformative. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I have a lot of thoughts about that. All of this applies, of course, to that, because it's all in there. And in fact, one of the historical enactments that I devoted 15 years of my career to was the portrayal of Angelina Grimke, who was a abolitionist who grew up on a plantation in Charleston, South Carolina, and then joined the abolitionist movement as a speaker. And the courage that she had to stay connected, to know that her voice mattered and her story could actually change the stories of others and the meaning that they were making of them, was instrumental not only in the abolitionist movement, but in the women's movement. So one young woman in her 20s in the 1830s had a lasting impact that carried on. The other resource I want to direct you to is that Barnard College did a curriculum on storytelling and racism. And in it, they have a model, and it's free. It's on the web. You can get the whole curriculum, but they outline that there are, they see four kinds of stories. There is the dominant culture story that they call the stock story, that leaves out the truths of the marginalized stories or voices. Those are called the concealed stories, which are underneath, which are either not given airspace or time or believed or valued. So those are sort of counter to each other, the dominant story and the concealed story. And then they have another of how one works with those, and they call them the hero story. So who are the heroes who are actually out there trying to change the story? And then they have the counter story. And the counter story is actually bringing that concealed story to light. So how do we raise the stories of marginalized voices, that they are heard and valued? And that's the advocacy work that actually I spend a lot of time doing, working with people. And that's where I've worked for social reform, of empowering those who've been incarcerated, those who are homeless, to actually, I work with them beginning with what are their thin stories, thicken them where they feel actually the power and agency to know that their story matters and can change another's stories, and then move them towards advocacy, which is integrating it and not only changing their story, but changing the story for others by moving towards social reform. So I will put my email in the chat, and I'm happy to send you the link to the curriculum, or anyone else who would like that. Just reach out.
What college was it? You said Bernard College?
Barnard,
Barnard.
Barnard. It's a women's college in New York City. Barnard.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful.
Jeff, I think we have time for one more.
Okay. From my Bardic tradition that I was trained in, we teach that there's only one story. You have the world story, and every story is a part of that story. So your story is a part of my story. Now, with what Sarah was talking about, I was at a middle school in St. Louis doing allegedly a Scottish storytelling program to promote the Scottish Highland Games, but it was a predominantly Black school. The kids were, why do we want to hear these stories? What do these have to do with us? You're a white guy telling stories. What does that have to do with us? You don't understand us. And I looked at him and said, you know, you're right in part, but my ancestors were Celtic, Scots, Irish, Welsh. Many of them came to this country as indentured servants. Well, what's that? Well, that's a fancy white word for slavery. They had never heard of the company store that we had in the Appalachian Mountains, which basically was slavery. They weren't familiar with indentured servitude, which was slavery. A lot of times we just have to be willing to step out of the box and pull in something from the side to let them know, no, you're not alone. Those things are not something that just happen to you. They happen to everybody, because all our stories eventually flow together.
And as Jeff and I were actually talking in the breakout time, and one of the things we talked about is that the bones usually contain human truths, but sometimes you need to dress the bones differently so that people can hear them. And that's an example of that perfectly, Jeff. You brought in the bones and they were saying, I'm not buying it, but you dressed them differently such that they resonated for them and connected. That's the work and power of story. I realize I'm at the end of my time. Thank you all for being present and engaging. I put my email in the chat if you want to reach out to me. Happy to send you links to that curriculum or answer any further questions, or send you any of these templates I shared today if that would be of help to you.